All right, so today we're looking through our skeletal system. Purpose of today's lesson is to give you guys a pretty good understanding of, not only being able to define like what we mean when we're talking about different divisions of our skeletal system, but also like what those structures are and how they function as it sort of relates to like our movement and stuff, right? So after this presentation, we want you guys to be able to understand how the entire skeletal system works and then how it adapts in response to stress, because obviously as trainers we are going to be putting a lot of stress on our clients, and that's going to have a lot to do with like how that system is going to adapt. So looking at the skeletal system, we do call it our body's framework because it is there to sort of give us shape, right? I think I said this yesterday, but like if we were nothing but like a nervous system and maybe like a little bit of a muscular system, we'd basically be like a jellyfish, like if you look at like jellyfish anatomy, which funny enough, I think I saw that was like the first picture like came up was like a little bit of anatomy there. You'll see that like really all they are is like a sort of a floating nervous system. There's a little bit of like tissue around them. Where'd that go? Oh, that's not what I'm looking for. There's like a little bit of tissue around them, but for the most part, like they're just like a little bit of muscle, but like you can see some like organs here and then like those tentacles. And then for the most part, they're just nerves, like you can see they got like a nerve ring that kind of surrounds the whole thing. Their whole body is kind of one big nervous system with some muscle around it. But without that framework, they just kind of lackadaisically move around. And that works a little bit in water, because water is obviously there's all the like the viscosity of the water and stuff like that. You can just kind of like push yourself against it without bones. But like in order to be able to move around like the world that we live in, we have to have like a good solid framework. And our skeletal system is going to be inside our body. Like obviously there are also like insects. They don't necessarily have a skeletal system. They just have sort of an exoskeleton, which is like a skeleton. It's just it's not as like hard of a framework. It's kind of nice because like as a bug, that means you could fall off the Empire State Building and hit the ground and probably still be okay. Exoskeletons have got their own advantages and stuff. But the disadvantage is that they're not able to grow to very large size, which is a disadvantage for them and a major advantage for us. I don't know about you guys, but I don't want any 6-foot crickets running around the world. So that's sort of the nice thing about like having this framework. And so it does kind of give us like an overall structure, and that structure is actually really going to be important for how we are talking about like how we're designed, right? So it gives us a framework. It provides a resting ground for our muscles, so our muscles are able to like have a place to live, and that gives them something to manipulate. It also does protect our delicate structures. We got this thick cranium here, which keeps our nervous system intact. We've got our vertebrae, which are keeping the rest of our nervous, your central nervous system is entirely protected with your skull and your vertebrae. And then, all your major organs are protected for the most part, thanks to your rib cage and scapula and things like that, your pelvis here. And then also, what is probably the most important is your bones are going to act as levers in order for us to be able to produce movement, right? So you think about like what a lever is, right? Let's see if I can find like a good picture of this is going to be just like yeah, you take a look here, you can kind of see like how different levers kind of work throughout the world, right? Like, you've got this pivot point here, and then like this is a big long lever, like in the scissors, right? And you get a big, pivot point here, right? Your muscles recruiting to like lift stuff up, they need to manipulate this big long lever here, right? I'm trying to get this lever, right? This big rod here to come this way. And so luckily my bones are kind of able to provide those levers for me. And then my muscles can manipulate them, right? And they're going to manipulate them around like the framework that is my joints. So your bones are obviously a big part of our skeletal system. And so, that's usually what people think of when they think of our skeletal system. They often think of like just the bones themselves. But that's not the only part of your skeletal system. It's not just your bones, right? Your bones are sort of half of the system, right? They're the levers that we're talking about, which obviously makes them very important. But another part of that tissue that we have to talk about are your joints. Joints are going to be the junction where two bones are coming together, and there's a lot of specialized structures within those joints. So now we've got like the levers themselves, and then we've got junctions where those levers are kind of meeting with one another, which allows them to pivot. We can call that a fulcrum, or we could call that a joint, which is a much easier sort of term to use, right? And so that connective tissue that's within those joints is really where like all the hard work of manipulation comes in. So when our skeletal system is getting moved around, it is thanks to our muscular system, sort of dragging it from place to place. So we'll call that an articulation. That's sort of the fancy name for a joint, but it's where two bones are sort of coming together. So when we're talking about like how our skeletal system like grows and how it remodels itself, that's a really big part of like our job, right? Like we know that the skeletal system is going to naturally grow just like any other tissue, but a lot of times like people have this idea that the skeletal system is just like dead tissue that happens to kind of live in your body, right? Like we see, you picture like I always think of like cartoons. I don't know about you guys, but like I watched a lot of Looney Tunes growing up, and there was always like, whenever there was like a Looney Tunes cartoon that took place in the desert, there was always like a cartoon skeleton, like that was like always a thing. It was always meant to show that it's hot and deserty. Or you think about like Star Wars, there's the crate dragon skeleton, like just hanging out there, from that scene in Star Wars. We always kind of think of that, or at least that's how I always think of it. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but we think of it as like this tissue that's kind of left around, after we're gone. But what's funny about that is that like all you're seeing in that skeletal system is the calcium. You're seeing the leftover rock that does live inside our body for sure. But you're seeing like the dead tissue, or like at least not the alive tissue that's kind of left around. But your bones are very much alive. They're made up of cells that are constantly, they have their own metabolism, and they're living and they're growing. And so your skeletal system is this living thing inside your body, and it's constantly remodeling itself. And so we can have an effect on that remodeling process through physical activity. And that's really a big part of like what we're going to talk about today. So your joints are, like I said, they're the connective, they're the points where they're coming together. So it is going to be connected via ligaments, right? So ligaments are what are going to attach like one bone to another, and then your muscles are manipulating those bones because those muscles are attached with tendons. We'll talk about the differences between those in just a little bit. So the bones are providing that resting ground. The joints are the junctions where the manipulation can occur. And that's what we call that an articulation. It's because that's where, the movement sort of occurs. So we'll come back to this in just a second. Also, welcome, Alyssa. It's good to have you this morning.
Thank you, likewise.
Yeah, I don't normally see you in the morning. Close that. So let's see here. For skeletal system. All right, so here's kind of a fun little video that is going to sort of break this down for us, give you a good idea of how this system sort of works. And I think there's going to be an ad. Okay. It's kind of a fun, he's going to start off with a very funny bone here. All right, here we go.
My friends, is a Walrus Baculum. It's basically a penis bone found in most placental mammals, interestingly not in humans. And this is a polar bear skull, which as you can see is more streamlined for swimming in the water than a grizzly bear skull. And over here we have my giant friend, the rhino head, which is good for being giant, for fighting off predators and fighting for, I don't know why do rhinos have big heads. And this is the skull of a pronghorn antelope. It has these horns that come off that are covered in these keratin sheaths that fall off once a year. These are all bones, parts of skeletons, and they're all pretty freaking awesome, and I am surrounded by them here at the Philip L. Wright Zoological Museum at the University of Montana. And all of these bones have adapted to help animals survive. The horns on the pronghorn for mating displays and self-defense, the streamlined skull of a polar bear for swimming in the water, and the Walrus Baculum for longevity, I guess. We're used to thinking of our skeletons as being the dead parts of us because that's what's left over after all of our stuff that looks like us has rotted away. But the fact is, our bones make up a vital organ system, and I don't just mean vital in that without them you would be a sort of disgusting dead pile of lumpy mush, but also in the traditional meaning of vital, meaning it's alive. It protects your vital organs, it makes locomotion possible, it manufactures your blood, and on top of it all, it takes care of its own repair and maintenance. Your skeleton is alive, people, and walrus penises are just the beginning. So you know what bones are, but maybe you didn't know that you don't have to be a vertebrate or even a chordate to have a skeleton. Jellies and worms, for instance, have hydrostatic skeletons made up of fluid-filled body cavities. By squeezing muscles around the cavities, they change their shapes, and that can be used to produce movement. Insects have exoskeletons, of course, made of the nitrogenous carbohydrate chitin, and most mollusks have exoskeletons too, in the form of calcium carbonate shells. But when it comes to skeletons, the winningest formula has been the endoskeleton. Even though we'd probably feel a lot safer if we were covered with armored plates like some race of Iron Men, having skeletons inside of our bodies has allowed us to grow larger and have much more freedom of movement. That's good stuff. One of the many reasons you don't see ants the size of horses walking around is, well, one, it wouldn't be able to breathe, but also a body with such a huge volume would require an exoskeleton that was exponentially thicker and therefore heavier and clumsier to support it. So endoskeletons allow animals to grow larger by supporting more mass, plus you don't have to worry about the embarrassment that comes with unsightly molting. As adults, humans have 206 bones, all kinds of shapes and sizes, including 3 tiny ones in each ear, 1 weird-shaped one like a horseshoe in your throat, 27 in your hands, and 26 in each foot. You also have at least 32 teeth unless you play too much hockey, and even though they're included in the skeletal system, they don't count as bones because they're made up of different material, namely dentin and enamel, the hardest material in your body. And you probably think of the skull as one big bone, but it actually consists of many separate bones, including 8 plates that cover your brain and 14 others in your face. Face bones. So simple, right? Well, you might want to sit down, you probably already are, but I'm going to, because it's time for biolography. Now you'd think that we'd have nailed down the basics of the human skeleton a long time ago because our teeth and our bones are the biggest and hardest parts of our bodies, and after we leave this mortal coil, they're what stick around the longest. It's not like they're super hard to find and study. Surely all of those ancient physicians who basically invented medical science would have inventoried all of our bones pretty soon after they figured out that we had bones, right? If the answer was yes, do you think I'd be sitting here? Most of what we know about the human skeletal system is thanks to Andreas van Vesel, who was born in what's now Belgium in 1513. And in those days, if you were like a kung fu master of science, you pretty much got your own Latin name, so today he's known as Andreas Veselius. Veselius came from a long line of physicians to kings and emperors, and while studying in Paris, he began dorking around in cemeteries and became interested in what's now known as osteology, the study of bones. Perhaps Veselius' greatest contribution was showing the world that everything we thought we knew about osteology was wrong. See, back in those days, if you wanted to become a doctor, you didn't study bodies or see patients, you read stuff written by ancient Romans whose work was considered indisputable. Because, you know, those guys had long beards and they wore robes. But in his research, Veselius discovered that Roman texts about the skeleton, especially the teachings of the philosopher Dr. Galen, were way, way off. See, Roman law prohibited the dissection of human bodies, so none of those guys ever actually studied human innards. Instead, they dissected apes and pigs and donkeys and used that to make assumptions about the human body. And so for 15 centuries, young doctors were taught those assumptions. But Veselius revolutionized osteology and all of medicine by introducing a new practice, every pre-med student's favorite, human dissection. He instructed students by dismembering corpses in front of them and cataloging their parts, giving students the first opportunity ever to directly observe the inside of a human body. These new methods drew a lot of attention, particularly from a local judge who began donating bodies of the criminals that he executed to Veselius. Suddenly, the dude was up to his codpiece in pig thieves and murderers, and by the time he was 28, he'd done enough research that he published De Humani Corporis Fabrica on the fabric of the human body, a 7-volume text on human anatomy, including the first comprehensive description ever made of the human skeleton. Its beautifully detailed illustrations are thought to have been created in the studio of the Renaissance artist Titian, featuring pictures of flayed corpses positioned in symbolic poses, and many of the volumes, some of which still exist today, are bound in human skin. So the takeaway here is that even though bones are big and hard, the science behind them is far from obvious. Even though we tend to think of our bones as rigid and fixed, your skeleton is as dynamic as any other of your organ systems. It's built from scratch with ingredients in your blood. It's grown according to glands in your head, and probably coolest of all, it's constantly breaking itself down and rebuilding itself over and over again for as long as you live. Most new bone tissue starts out as cartilage, which you may know from your nose and your ears. It's made of specialized cells called chondrites, and in newly forming bones, these cells start dividing like crazy and secrete collagen and other proteins to form a cartilage model, or framework for the bones to form on. Soon, blood vessels work their way into the cartilage and bring plump little cells called osteoblasts. Oste, which you'll be hearing a lot of today, just means bone, and blast means germ or bud. The bone building that they do is called fittingly ossification. First, they secrete this gelatinous goo that's a combination of collagen and a polysaccharide that acts kind of like an organic glue. Then, they start absorbing a bunch of minerals and salts from the blood and all the capillaries around them. And unsurprisingly, they're especially absorbing calcium and phosphate. And they begin depositing those minerals onto the matrix. With the help of enzymes secreted by the osteoblasts, these chemicals bond to form calcium phosphate, which crystallizes to make your bone matrix. In the end, about 2/3 of your bone matrix is proteins like collagen, and the other third is calcium phosphate. Kind of surprising, right? Most of your bone isn't even mineral, and even the part that is living tissue, because it's all honeycombed with blood vessels that allow osteoblasts and other cells to do their jobs. Unlike an insect's exoskeleton, even the hardest parts of your bones are alive. Now, even though bone can take all kinds of forms, from big flat plates protecting the brain to the tiny stirrup in your ear, inside they all tend to have the same basic structure. If you cut one in half, you'd see that the matrix actually forms in 2 layers. The outer layer, called the compact or cortical bone, is hard and dense and makes up about 80% of the bone's mass. In the middle, the spongy or trabecular bone is softer and more porous and contains the marrow and fatty tissues in larger bones. The marrow, of course, makes not only new red blood cells, but almost all of your different blood cells by a process called hematopoiesis. I'd need like about a week of your time in a Greek dictionary to explain how it does this, but suffice it to say that evolution has wisely chosen the innards of our largest bones to house the blood stem cells that together can produce 1 trillion blood cells in you every day. That's 10 to the frickin' 12th. On the outside, the larger bones of your body have a similar structure. Have a look here at this femur. That's the biggest bone in your body. The main shaft is called the diaphysis, and each rounded end is an epiphysis. When the bones grow, as a child grows, the new tissue forms the border between the two, a place called the epiphyseal plate. As they did when they formed the original bone tissue, chondrocytes start to produce new cartilage here, and the osteoblasts come in and lay down more collagen and calcium phosphate. So as you grow, the ends of your bones are actually growing away from each other until by the time you're about 25, the last of these plates in your bones hardens. By the way, this whole process is stimulated by growth hormones secreted from glands all over your body, but the head honcho right here is the pituitary gland, about the size of a pea, nestled at the base of your brain. As adults, this and other glands produce less growth hormone, which slows down our bone lengthening. But Even though lengthening is a limited time only process, the thickness and strength of a bone must continually be maintained by the body. Because, of course, like all of your cells, bone cells go through a lot of wear and tear and need to be able to adjust to changing conditions. So over the course of each year of your adult life, about 10% of your skeleton is completely broken down and then rebuilt from scratch in a process called bone remodeling. Here the main players are the osteoblasts, again, and another kind of cell that's kind of their complete opposite, the osteoclasts, or bone breakers. You'd think maybe that the cells that form bone tissue and the ones that destroy it would be in some kind of constant battle in your body, but during remodeling, they work closely together and actually communicate nicely. It's like they're basically frenemies. Remodeling begins when osteoclasts are sent by way of hormone signals through the capillaries to the sites of microscopic fractures in the bone matrix. Once they're in place, they secrete an acidic cocktail of hydrogen ions to dissolve the calcium phosphate into calcium ions, phosphate, and water, and other material that they carry back to nearby capillaries. Then they secrete enzymes that specialize in digesting collagen. This whole process is called resorption, and when the old bone tissue has been cleaned up, the osteoclasts send out a hormone shout out to the osteoblasts, who come in and do their ossification thing. Bone remodeling is really pretty amazing, and it's all ultimately regulated by hormones that maintain the levels of calcium in your blood. The glands that call all the plays during the bone-breaking part of the remodeling are the parathyroids in your neck. When the calcium in your blood plasma falls below the level of homeostasis, the parathyroid triggers osteoclasts to take calcium out of your bones and release it back into the blood. Likewise, when blood calcium levels are too high, the parathyroid's cousin, the thyroid gland, signals osteoblasts to take calcium out of the blood and lay it down on the bone collagen through more ossification. And remember last week when we talked about how the kidneys reabsorb salts and minerals? Well, the thyroid also regulates how much calcium is reabsorbed in that process, as well as the amount of vitamin D, because vitamin D helps your body absorb calcium through the small intestine, and that is why vitamin D is all good for your bones and stuff. Now, the relation of active osteoblast to active osteoclast can change dramatically under different conditions. The more you stress your bones, the more osteoclasts work to break down the bone matrix so that it can be reformed. Bone stress can include stuff like fractures, of course, but it can also be less traumatic and more sustained. Exercise causes stress on the skeleton that helps stimulate bone remodeling, so when you're working out, you're not only building muscle, you're also building bone. So, as you can tell, it's kind of hard to talk about bones without also talking about muscles, and that's what we're going to do on the next episode of Crash Course Biology. Thank you so much to the Philip L. Wright Zoological Museum at the University of Montana. Sorry, I just hit you. Check out their Tumblr at umzoology.tumblr.com. It's awesome. If you want to review anything, table of contents, just click on it, or just rewatch the whole episode because you know you liked it. And if you have any questions for us, of course, we will be in the comments below, as will all of the super helpful people who are always answering questions who are not us. Thank you to those people, by the way. And we will see you next time on Crash Course Biology.
All right, so a lot of stuff going on there. Let's go ahead and talk about it, right? So one of the things I love about that video is like you just see over and over and over and over again this idea of like form following function, right? Like things are shaped a certain way so that they can act a certain way, right? Because we need them to be shaped a certain way. You know, it's just like a constant sort of like circle feeding into itself. So when we're looking at this, I think this is most prevalent in our skeleton. When I talk about like what good form is, I'm not talking about it from the aspect of like, this is how I like to do things. We're talking about it from the idea that like, you know, this is how our skeletal system most effectively moves. When we start to see, let's say you see somebody like, let's say somebody's doing like a squat of some type, right? And you always see this a lot of times. You see somebody's like knees buckle inwards, right? We see this in like caving in action, right? The reason that that's happening is because like certain muscles that are controlling that skeletal system are controlling it improperly. We're seeing, you know, this unalignment, right? Like the knee is kind of coming down on the inside of the foot here, rather than, honestly, I actually think that's a little too far out. We want second and third toe. He's kind of on his pinky toe there. But that's sort of the ideal version, right? Second and third toe, like dead center of your foot is sort of where we're aiming. And the reason is because like when you come in with your knee like this, it puts pressure on your meniscus. It puts pressure on all of the soft tissue found between your bones. There's sort of a grinding action there. They are designed specifically to move in a certain way. So we're gonna see two primary divisions in our skeletal system, right? We are gonna have our axial skeleton, that is sort of along like the axial line. So in the middle of in the center of everything, right? So that's gonna be your skull, your rib cage, and your vertebrae, right? So we look at axial versus appendicular. You can kind of see the two different versions here, right? So the axial skeleton is there to really kind of protect all of this like inner stuff, right? And then your appendicular skeleton is what does all the fancy work of like moving things around, you know, your pelvis, for instance, that's your pelvic girdle. Your pelvic girdle attaches your appendicular skeleton to your axial. And then it has like your leg bones and your feet bones, like all of that is gonna, you know, produce human movement. And then you've got your scapula, which is your shoulder girdle, which attaches onto the arms. So those are two of the primary divisions there. Now, we talked about this in the video, and this is probably why we spend so much time looking at the biology of our skeletal system, but your bones are constantly remodeling. They're constantly going through this process where they are breaking down old bone tissue in order to build up new bone tissue, right? So again, as a reminder, your bones are alive, right? Like we definitely see all the dead stuff left behind after we're gone, but like while they're in your body, they are very much like a living tissue made up of these cells right here. So bone remodeling is this process of resorbing old bone, like taking out the damaged stuff and building up the new stuff. So it's the process of breaking down old or imperfect bone tissue in order to make new. Now, when you're young, you know, your osteoblasts, which are the bone builders, they're really, really, really active. And so we're constantly like building new bone tissue. In fact, children are actually constantly turning collagen into bone tissue for the very first time, thanks to their osteoblasts. But as we get older, unfortunately, our osteoblasts kind of slow down. They stop building up that new bone tissue. And these other cells, our osteoclasts, they come along and they start building, you know, they start breaking down our bone tissue. It's kind of a classic example of like, if you don't use it, you lose it, you know? So just showing you kind of what this looks like. When I say like imperfect bone tissue, right? If we picture like a really thick line here, you know, if I picture just like, let's say like this is what our bone tissue looks like, right? You know, it's this really thick, you know, material, and you know, but then all of a sudden it gets some type of like imperfection in it, right? And so maybe it's got like, you know, this little hook right here, or maybe it's just got like a little bit of it's been like damaged. You know, what's going to end up happening is your osteoclasts are actually going to come along and they're going to kind of shave all that off. And then what they'll do is they'll lay down new bone tissue. They'll actually lay down new bone tissue and it'll make it thicker and more resistant to damage in the future, right? So now we've got a slightly more bone, because that's kind of the process that your body always takes, right? Like, you know, if you, you know, like let's say like you were working on something and every day you come out and it gets just like a little bit damaged, you know, what are you going to do? Well, you're probably going to try to do your best to make it more resistant to damage in the future, right? Like you're probably going to come along and fix it up and make it like more damage resistant. That's the same thing that your body does. That's how we grow our muscles, you know? Like you don't build muscle in the gym. When you go to the gym, you're not building muscle, you're breaking muscle. You're actually losing muscle mass every time you go work out. But later you go eat and you sleep and you rest and you recover, and your body then builds up that bone, you know, that muscle tissue. So muscle is built in the kitchen. It's built in your bed, not in the gym, you know, which is what's like, that's the scientific approach. Now, obviously your body has no reason to build that stuff up unless you give it a reason to. And that's where the gym comes in. We need to break everything down so that our body comes along and goes, what did you do? You know, like, oh my God, you know, and it has to fix everything, right? That's the same thing about your skeletal system, right? Your skeletal system comes along and sort of like builds everything back up afterwards. So that's where our osteoblasts and our osteoclasts come in, right? Osteoblasts are going to build it up. The osteoclasts are going to get rid of all the deteriorated bone, right? So you would think that like osteoclasts are kind of the bad guy in this scenario, but we do actually want them to come along and break down that bone tissue because it's ineffective. So this is part of the reason why it's so important for us to exercise with what we call weight-bearing exercise. So weight-bearing exercise in particular has been shown to be the most effective for bone growth. And you're going to hear me say this a lot, but what I mean when I say weight-bearing is I mean it's any type of activity that works against gravity as a resistance. Like I think that spinning and cycling are very, very good for you. I think swimming is an exceptionally great form of exercise in general for your cardiovascular system, for your muscular system. But there is something special about lifting weights and working against gravity in particular that is very good for our bone density. So while I like swimming, I actually would prefer like the Stairmaster or getting on a treadmill or going for a jog, going for a hike, working against like gravity as a resistance. And then obviously, and I'm very biased here, lifting weights is probably going to be the best example of how to develop a really strong and functional skeletal system. So you do want to kind of keep these cells in your brain. Your osteoclasts, they're your bone breaker downers. And then your osteoblasts, those are your bone builder uppers. Those are the technical terms. And that whole thing is called, like I said, it's called bone remodeling. Now, one thing to keep in mind about bone remodeling, and something that is another example of like form following function, is that remodeling will tend to follow the lines of stress that are placed upon your bones. So what I mean by that is your bones will reflect whatever type of stress you put on them. If you don't put any stress on them at all, you're going to have very weak bone tissue. You put a lot of stress on them, you're going to have very strong, very dense bone tissue. And that sounds great. But another thing to remember is that like your bones will also shape themselves based on however you are functioning, which means if you habitually have poor posture, what is going to happen is your bones will actually eventually reflect that. So let's say like kyphosis of the spine is a very, very good example of this. No, am I talking about kyphosis today? Sorry, just checking forward because I know I talked about it in this class. Yeah, it's coming up later in other classes. So we'll talk more about like what kyphosis actually means later. But kyphosis is what we see when someone has that sort of hunchback posture. Now, sometimes people are born with this, sometimes that's just something that happens at an early age, but oftentimes it's what happens at a sort of at a very old age, right? So you'll start to see this, what we call a kyphotic curve, right? And so if you're constantly sitting with poor posture, it starts to round out the back, right? It starts to round out your shoulders. And then sometimes like, your body's trying to find a way to fix that. So what it'll do is it'll scoop the spine in this way. So now you have an excessive arch in your low back and excessive rounding in your shoulders. Those are often very tied together, or you'll just have like a sort of like C shape the entire time, right? And so that is sort of what we're seeing there. And that poor posture can cause aches and pains, and eventually it becomes very difficult to get back into that upright posture. So this is another reason why habitual exercise and maintenance of good posture are so important, right? We want to make sure that we are aligning ourselves properly. So that is sort of the biology of bone growth and how that works. Any questions on that before we move into the next section here? Questions, comments, concerns, guys?
Nope.
All right, sounds like everybody's good.
Good. Yeah.
Cool. Love that. All right, let's take a look at our types of bones, because obviously there's a whole bunch of them, right? This is one of my favorite parts because I think some of these bones are actually kind of silly. I think the names are very lazy. So we got long bones. Guess what? these are the bones that are longer than they are anything else. They're your long, like cylindrical bones. So obviously the perfect example is your femur. That's what we're seeing here. This is the longest bone in your body. That's your thigh bone. And you can see like this is the one that's going to insert onto your pelvis, right? So, you know, this would be someone's right thigh bone. We're seeing it on, you know, this would be our left, but they're right. And so it would insert right here. You know, this would go into they'd have a pelvis like right here. And then there's this outer, like what we call a trochanter here, that is this like big knob sticking out on that bone. That actually allows a lot of muscles to kind of come along and get a really good grip on that bone. And then it's this big long bone that allows us to have this very, very big long lever here, and allows us to kind of, you know, propel ourselves around the world. So this is a really good example of what a long bone looks like, because it's obviously very long, more so than it is anything else. You can see the various different layers here as well. You can see like here's where all your red blood cells are going to, or I'm sorry, your white blood cells are going to get created. And then here you're going to have this spongy bone here. That's where you're going to create your white blood cells. Did I get turned around there? Sorry, this is the spongy bone. That's where we create our white blood cells. This is the compact bone where we create our red blood cells, which is kind of cool. And then these ends are actually where like the growth is occurring. When we actually do grow, you know, our bone starts out like being relatively long, but then we just add to the ends of it and it sort of stretches itself away like this, as we are growing from like youth to adulthood. So those are your long bones. There's more parts to it as well, but not a lot of that is actually going to come up in our materials, or, you know, the topics that are important to us. We really just want to pay attention to the fact that honestly, they're big, long bones. You know, your humerus is a good example, but so is your femur. Obviously your wrist bones, but even like if we look at the hand here, even like these metacarpals here are actually examples of long bones. Obviously, my palm is not nearly as long as like my femur, right? But they are still longer than they are anything else. Now you look here at the actual carpels themselves. These are what we call short bones. These are sometimes called cuboid bones because they are, you know, more of a sort of a square in shape, right? So short bones or cube bones, you know, these are very similar in length and width. Okay, the carpels of your hand are a really good example of that. The tarsals of your feet are a really good example of that. If we look at like our tarsals, you know, you'll see like all of these sort of cube-shaped bones here, right? And then there's your metatarsals, right, making up the bridge there. So those are short bones. And short bones are really interesting because they all kind of need to like kind of glide around, you know, like I can take my wrist here and I can kind of, you know, rotate it like this, and I can, you know, spin my palm in like that. You know, I've got a lot of range of motion. All those bones are kind of sliding together in different ways and stuff. It was really funny. I thought of it, it popped into my mind yesterday. Like I follow the guy, we just watched his video, Hank. I follow him on Instagram, and he was showing there's this really rare type of rock, bendable rock. There's this really, really, really weird type of rock. Oh, Chris, do you have a question? You came unmuted. Chris, I'm gonna go ahead and put you on mute.
Sorry.
Oh, no problem. So take a look. This is rock, and we don't really fully understand it. They haven't really like been able to look super internally, but like how crazy is that? Look at that. It's a freaking rock, you know, and it bends. But the theory, they were talking about this. He was talking about this in the video. The reason they think it works is they basically think it's like a whole bunch of like, you know, outer plates and then inner plates, and they all kind of fit together very similarly to your carpels or your tarsals, you know, like they're hard tissue, but they all kind of slide along one another, and it kind of gives this idea that they can kind of bend, which I think is just super cool. I saw that like 3 days ago, and I was sitting in bed with my girlfriend. I was like, oh man. And she was like, what? And I was like, I'm going to talk about this in my class because I know the skeletal system's coming up. And she was, you know, not amused because I, you know, woke her up. So yeah, so those are our long bones and our short bones. Now you've also got flat bones. Flat bones are really cool. Flat bones tend to be really thin and very protective. Weird versions of this are going to be like your scapula, right? Your scapula is this very cool sort of flat bone here. But even like your patella, your kneecap is a really good example of that. Your sternum is a flat bone. It's there to kind of protect, you know, everything as it kind of comes in. Then we've also got, this is my favorite one, this category, irregular bones. These are all the weirdly shaped bones. It's like scientists were going through all the names and they're like, I don't know, there's so many, just call the rest of them irregular bones, you know, like, but irregular bones have a very unique shape and a very unique structure. And honestly, your vertebrae are the perfect example of that. You know, if you look at your vertebrae, they have all these really cool shapes, and they're different from one another. You know, if you look at your cervical vertebrae versus your thoracic versus your lumbar, look at the very different shapes here, right? Very, very, very oddly shaped bones, and they have holes in them. I mean, look at this, right? You can see, you know, there's a hole running through them. That's where your spinal canal actually, you know, that's your spinal canal. That's where your spinal column runs through, you know, is this little hole right here. And then there's two really cool ones. You've got like your atlas. You've got two vertebrae at the very, very top called your atlas vertebrae and your axis vertebrae, which are really, really cool. That's the very, very top of your skull, way up here. And what's really cool about this, we've got probably the coolest atlas and axis vertebrae in the entire animal kingdom. It is part of the evolutionary process that has like given us a major advantage compared to any other animal on the planet. And that's a kind of a cool thing to say, but like what I mean by this is you'll actually notice on your atlas vertebrae, right? This is this big, wide, this is your C, this is your C1. Okay, this is the very top, this is your first vertebrae, right? That your skull sits on. By the way, I love the name, the atlas vertebrae. You know, Atlas was the guy who held up the world, right? He was cursed by Zeus or whoever to like, you know, he was the Titan who was in charge of like holding up the universe forever. And so, you know, it kind of holds up our skull, which I think is just like that's the best name in anatomy, you know, because it's there to kind of hold up our world. But then your axis vertebrae, look at how much thinner it is. And it's got a little process there, but this one's missing that process. And then it's got this little, you know, chunk out here. This is where like the first little bit of muscle is able to insert. So when you put an atlas vertebrae and an axis vertebrae together, the coolest thing can happen, which is that it can keep our head upright while we are sprinting at maximum effort. That is really, really rare in the animal kingdom. I know this doesn't sound like the biggest deal in the world, but us being able to keep our head upright while we are running at full speed is one of the greatest evolutionary advantages that we have as an organism on this planet, because it allows us to simply open our jaw to be able to breathe and vent heat. So we can sprint and breathe through our mouth, and we can get rid of heat very, very quickly. Because when your body overheats, you can't run anymore. You know, you start getting very acidic and you have to slow down. You can experience heat stroke. A lot of really dangerous things can happen. And we can actually get rid of heat. This is actually why your dog has to pant, right? They don't have like the ability to sort of vent heat while they're running at maximum effort. If they're running as hard as they can, their head kind of gets locked in and their jaw stays closed and they're not able to get rid of heat. The only way dogs can sweat is through their tongue. The other thing that makes us amazing is at venting heat is the fact that, you know, we have sweat glands all over our entire body. That's also pretty darn rare. Like pigs can do it, but they don't have the ability to sprint the way we can. And this is what, and I know this is also kind of a controversial sentence, but this is what makes us the fastest animal on the planet, the fastest land animal on the planet. And I know that sounds crazy considering that there's things like cheetahs, and I also can't outrun my freaking dog, you know. That sounds nuts. But what I mean is, like, if you give us enough time, we will run down any animal on the planet. Like, we're not faster than a cheetah in the short term, but we are absolutely faster than them in the long term. We are able to cover more distance than any other animal on the planet on land if you give us enough time. And that is because we can vent heat on the go better than any other animal on the planet. If that is not a sign that tells you like that we are meant to exercise, like biologically, we are meant to be very active, physical creatures that like constantly are running around, doing physical stuff. I don't know what will convince, like we've got all of this evidence. We vent heat through our sweat. We vent heat by being able to like keep our head upright. We've got this giant glute muscle, which we don't have to actually even talk about today, but we're going to get into later. All of these advantages that make us one of the greatest athletes on the planet. Which is pretty cool. And I love to talk about that. That's probably my favorite. The atlas vertebrae is probably my favorite bone in the body. So it's irregularly shaped. It's a very weird shape that allows us to do very cool things. There is sort of one more category here that I put in. Now, this is not necessarily a type of major bone, but there is sort of a special type of bone that is called a sesamoid bone. And these are small, usually round bones that are actually embedded within a joint capsule. So what's interesting about this is a bone that isn't actually connected with like a ligament or, your traditional connective tissue. Instead, it's just kind of floating in a little bubble within like an actual joint. So your patella is a really good example of this. You look at your patella, it sits here on the knee, right? Like it just kind of lives in front of your femur and your tibia. And nothing's actually holding it there except for, well, at least nothing's holding it there in terms of like, a skeletal system, right? Like your skeletal system is held together with ligaments, right? There are no ligaments holding this on. So how the heck does this bone stay put? Well, your muscular system actually runs over top of it. Let me find, there we go. Is actually a picture showing like inflammation, but look at your skeletal, your muscular system here. This is your quadriceps. It actually runs over top of that bone and inserts over here. So this bone is just kind of embedded within the tissue, even though it's not actually connected to the tissue. And that's what a sesamoid bone is. You got a couple other ones like in your hands and stuff, but this is sort of the perfect example. Weirdly, if you have ever known somebody to get like a bunion, or if you've ever had a bunion, it's almost like, oh, that's not what I wanted to pull up. Where you see somebody get like these big knobs here. That is actually where like connective tissue is basically being squirted out between the joint, and then it starts to harden. And it becomes like, it's basically like a big chunk of like cartilage, and then it kind of screws.
I have that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
sometimes.
That often happens. If you can purchase something like this and wear this like when you go to bed, it can kind of help that from getting any worse. I would definitely talk to a podiatrist before just like taking that and doing it yourself. But yeah, this is it's painful, because it's basically, shoving your skeletal system out of alignment.
So that keeps it like a little cast in a way, like straightened out.
Yeah, it basically like straightens it and gets you to a place where you can kind of hold it where you need it to be.
Are those things hereditary, or are they like, does it just depend like if it develops from like small shoes and stuff?
So it's a little bit hereditary. Yeah, it's a little bit hereditary, and it's a little bit like from wearing small shoes. Yeah. So
got it.
I would get a wider toe box. Like if you look at like, it's not about getting just like wide shoes in general. Like, you can get like a pair of Vans that are like oversized for you. And that's, Vans are actually a fairly wide shoe, but what you want to do is you want to get like a runner's shoe wide toe box. You want to get a runner's shoe that has particularly like a wide toe box. So if you can get something that's sort of shaped like this, where it kind of bulges out like that, it'll actually give you a little bit more of an advantage, and it'll help with that. And they don't have to be expensive like this. I'm sure every one of these super major running shoes are crazy expensive. And then you just get like, it's called a toe spreader. And they're little silicone things that you basically like spread out your toes. They're really helpful. I will say bunions are technically a medical thing, so I am not giving you medical advice here. If you want the medical approach, you should talk to a podiatrist, talk to a foot doctor. But there's a lot of evidence that shows that it can be very helpful for bunions. But bunions are kind of like, they're very similar to how we grew our skeletal system. You know, it's basically this like cartilage that starts to build up. You know, it's like connective tissue that starts to harden. If that started absorbing calcium, it would become like a full-on bone. It's not going to, you know, because like, you know, you're an adult, and so like growing new bones as an adult is pretty rare. But like, that's kind of an example of like how sesamoid bones actually work. They're basically embedded within connective tissue. So that is sort of like the types of bones that we've got. Now let's take a look at some of our bone markings so we can get familiar with that. So your bones have all these really cool shapes. You know, they've got all of these very interesting little dents in them, or they might have little projections from them, right? Those little dents, these bone markings are dents or projections that allow muscles or ligaments to get a really good attachment, okay? It allows your muscles to get a grip. Honestly, I like to think of it as like, you know, rock climbing. You know, you're rock climbing, you're looking for like those, either a projection from the mountain, or you're looking for like a little dent that you can kind of get your hand in, you know? And so depressions are like the dents. These are either flattened or little indented portions of bones that allow like a muscle to have like a resting place to get like a really good grip. Or you'll have like a process, and a process is like a projection from a bone that a muscle or a tendon or a ligament can get like a really good grip on, right? So when you look at your vertebrae, you know, you can see all of these little projections here. Those are your vertebral processes, right? And that is what allows all of these little, they're called your transverso spinalis muscles, to get like a little bit of grip, you know, to create stability on the backside of your spine. So you can see this kind of just running up the entire way, but because of all the like little processes that are coming out from there, I'm trying to find like the small version. There we go. Because of all those little processes coming out from there, you know, they're able to get like a really good grip. And so if you've ever pulled out your back, if you've ever just like pulled your back and thrown your back out and you're just like, you know, that's often because like one of these little muscles here basically got pulled. We had a lack of stability within the spine. And believe me, for those of you who are new, we are going to be talking a lot about spinal stability over this course and next courses and just all the time. But your processes, right? One of my favorite ones is the greater trochanter of your femur. It's that knob we were looking at earlier, right? It's that big projection there. That's called your trochanter, right? And you can feel it. If you ever just like, if you just bang on the side of your hip, you'll feel that like kind of big hard bone there. That's your greater trochanter. And muscles get, like all your glute muscles get a really good grip right there, right? This is kind of peeling away, like we're actually missing a lot of muscles here. But if you've ever had like a burning sensation at your hip from running around, that's actually where that muscle is rubbing on that process. We call that runner's hip, which is obviously not super great feeling. But that is where like tight muscles are sort of not manipulating your skeleton the way they're supposed to, you know? Again, just another example, function or form following function, right? So we're looking at your vertebral column. We can see this top section here. There are 7 in what we call the cervical vertebrae. That's like your neck. There's going to be 12 in your thoracic vertebrae. That's like your upper back. And then there are going to be 5 in your lumbar vertebrae, which is where a lot of our problems start to take place. Your lumbar vertebrae is usually where we, you know, hear about people having like a herniated disc or a bulging disc or, you know, something like that. My mom, for instance, she's got a bunch of herniations, but she also has like a couple cracked vertebrae in her lumbar section. My mom and her brothers, and unfortunately me, there's sort of a little bit of a genetic condition that happens to run in my mom's side of the family, where we actually get calcium deposits, usually on the lumbar section of our spine. For some reason, the Benson genes just love to make extra calcium, extra bone tissue on. And unfortunately, like if you're not physically active, what can happen is that bone tissue can build up and it's very, very, very weak. And then what ends up happening is if you twist, you can actually break your vertebrae. And so my mom has 4 broken vertebrae in her lumbar spine. It's fine for the most part, as long as she's like physically active and she keeps everything in alignment. But when stuff falls out of alignment, she basically can't walk. So that is your lumbar section. This is where we see most of our herniations. This and then the cervical section. Thoracic, usually pretty solid. We don't have a lot of like upper back problems for most of our clients. And then we got our sacrum here and your coccyx. Your coccyx is sort of what's left of your tail. And that's down here. We don't really do much with that, but the sacrum is actually what allows the 2 sides of your pelvis to come together and get a grip. So that is the section of your vertebrae. And we talked about our nervous system yesterday. If you look at like how your nervous system is sort of branching out, it's going to branch out from the various processes there in your vertebrae, which control very different parts of your body. Looking for an image that's actually high quality, please. But you can see, right, there's that central nervous system running down, and then there's the peripheral system as they are sort of branching away, controlling the various parts of your body. And if you want to get all those memorized, you can look at a chart like this and try to understand which processes are controlling which things. Holy crap, that's a lot of stuff. Like if you break your C4 vertebrae, it might affect your nose and your lips and, result in all kinds of problems, swallowing and things like that. But if you break your C5 vertebrae, that can mess up your vocal cords and things like that. Very interesting stuff here, and this is just all the, the organs and stuff. We're not even talking about like muscles here, which, is actually what we're going to spend our time on. So those are the various like parts of your vertebrae there. So for more information on the bone stuff, you can find that. Again, I need to update these freaking pages. I'm working on it. I promise I'm going to get them done. Trail Guide to Movement 36 through 39, or it is in the Skeletal System section of your NASM textbook, which used to be chapter 2. But at least to get you somewhat in the right place. It's going to be chapter 5 of your regular NASM textbook in the skeletal section. So that is where you can kind of follow up that reading. So there's the bones, right? We've looked at the bones. We got a pretty good understanding of like how they all fit together, hopefully, and hopefully a pretty good understanding of like how they're shaped and what their job is. That's the big thing I want you to understand is like, what the purpose of our bones is. And if you have a good understanding of that, going into the kinesiology stuff is going to come much more naturally. But the next thing we got to look at the joints, right? So we've looked at the hard tissue. Let's take a look at the space between and all the little structures that are in there. And this is where we're going to start talking about actual like movement proper, right? So there are going to be 3 major types of joint movement where one bone is sort of articulating with another, right? Like that's what a joint is where 2 bones are kind of coming together, right? And that allows like that manipulation, that movement, right? But there's going to be 3 major types of what we call arthrokinematics, which arthrokinematics is my least favorite term in biology. It is so dumb. Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 letters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Why do we have that word? Why does that word have to exist? We could just call it joint motion and give it a definition. Anyway, rant over. Arthrokinematics means joint motion. That's literally its entire definition. And arthro coming from the word to means, you know, joint or skeletal, and kinematic meaning motion. There are three major categories of joint movement. Now, you might have combinations of these. You might have like two movements occurring simultaneously within a joint. That's why we've got different types of joints that we'll look at in a minute. But for now, let's just take a look at these three major categories. So one of the actions that you're going to see is a rolling action. Okay, so you're going to see a rolling joint action, and that's when the surface of one bone rolls over the surface of another, right? So if we look at like rolling arthrokinematics, by the way, I've definitely learned how to Google this properly. As a teacher, you do not want to be caught Googling rolling joint action. That does not pull up the Google search images that you think it will. So a rolling action is where one bone is basically rolling over the surface of another, right? Let's see if I can find a good image of this. Yeah, kind of looks just like that, right? You can see it's literally just gonna kind of roll from place to place. Pretty simple, right? So that's our first one, but the next one we're going to see is a sliding or gliding joint action, which is where the surface of one bone is going to slide over another one. So we had our rolling action here, right? And then sliding action is going to be something more like this, right? If we look at like gliding or sliding, nope, that's back to the rolling picture, please. There we go. So actually, that's still an example of the roll. It's just showing you in a different way. Give me the glide. Come on. Gosh darn it. Well, yeah. I mean, it is happening. I mean, there's a little bit of it there, but oh yeah. I mean, you kind of get the. Oh, there we go. There it is. This is the classic one I'm looking for. So bring it back together, Google, and slide it around. There we go. So there's the sliding action that we're talking about, right? And then that last one, I'll show you. The spinning bit was its own thing, but there it is, the gliding action, right? So that's our second sort of major category, or sliding action, if you want to call it that. And then thirdly, you can actually see that in this one here. There's the spinning action at the very end. So, you know, there's the slide, and then there's the spin there at the end, right? You can see a spinning action here. So those are the three major categories, right? When you think of like the different types of joints you have, like you probably think of like a ball and socket joint, like your shoulder, right? It does a little bit of a roll, it does a little bit of sliding, and it does a little bit of spinning. It can really do everything. And that's why it's the most mobile joint in your body. So those are our three major categories of movements, right? Rolling, when one surface rolls over another. Here's a really good example, right? Your femur rolls over your tibia. When you're performing like knee extension, or, you know, you're seeing that rolling action there. But what's very interesting is at the same time, there's a little bit of a sliding action. If you actually look at like your, if you actually look at how your knee joint actually works, you'll notice it does, oh, that's not what I'm looking for. A little bit of both, right? It does the roll, but then let's see how it like slides at the very end there. It gets back into place and then it slides at the very end. That is both of those happening simultaneously, which is what we generally tend to see in what's called a hinge joint, which is what that is. And then spinning is, like I said, it's that rotational movement. So your radius, right, when you're pronating and supinating your hand like this, there's a little spinning action that's occurring in those two bones that make up your forearm. So those are our three major categories of joint motion, right? Now there are going to be, welcome back, Chris. there are going to be sort of different types of joints out there. There's going to be 3 major types, 2 major categories. So the one that you're probably thinking of when we say like a joint, you're probably thinking of a synovial joint. Synovial joints are what we call fully movable joints, right? These are joints that are held together with like a joint capsule. So there's a lot of space between the 2 bones as they're meeting. There's sort of a substantial amount of space between them, which gives them like a fuller range of movement. And those are the ones that are associated with joints. That's why we call them fully movable joints, okay? 80% of the joints in your body are synovial. They have a full range of movement, and they have all these specialized structures in there, like synovial fluid. Synovial fluid is this like viscous, kind of like egg white looking material that's in there to basically reduce friction. Obviously, if there's a lot of movement that can occur, with a lot of that movement, we got to be aware of the fact that like friction can happen. The more that we can move stuff around, the more there's friction, the more likely we are to sort of heat up our bones, and that can really cause some problems, right? So 80% are going to be synovial. That's really, we're going to spend most of our time. Like when we're talking about stuff as trainers, we're talking about human movement. We're mostly dealing with the synovial joints. But just so you know, there are the non-synovial joints. That's the other major category. There's sort of 2 versions of that. There's either your fibrous non-synovial joints, which are fully just not movable, right? Like your skull is made up, I want to say it's 7 bones. We don't move our skull very much, so I don't exactly, that's not my anatomy. Skull bones, how many? 7? 22. Oh, well, that's all the face bones. That doesn't count. I just want the skull itself, which is, this is where you start at, like, this is where we all start disagreeing on how many freaking bones there are. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, 6, and then, oh no, I guess it'd be 8, 7, and then the major one on the back. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, 8. Yeah, face bones don't count, at least if you ask me. But these are all held together with fibrous joints. Like they're all held together, you know, and it is a joint because that's 2 bones coming together. But it's not meant to move, you know, it's just all locked into place. And then there are cartilaginous joints. Cartilaginous joints have like a little bit of movement. And they're held together with like a little bit of cartilage. There's a little bit of space there. Honestly, the classic example is like your vertebrae. You know, they can do a little bit of movement right side to side, but they're really not meant to do like these major crazy ranges of motion. You know, like we think of like when we twist and stuff, we think that our spine is like twisting like crazy. It's really not. It is barely rotating just a little bit. All the stuff around it, like you're moving a lot. And then also because there's so many different segments, like if this vertebrae moves a little bit and that one moves a little bit and that one moves a little bit, it makes it look like there's a major amount of like movement occurring, but really it's very limited. Or if you think of like what holds your pelvis together, this is called your pubic symphysis. Very little movement occurs there. If we get too much movement there, we start to get like a lot of like groin issues and some serious pain that can be really problematic. You'll see it sometimes in like short distance sprinters, like a running back, for instance. Sometimes you'll see some instability in there. So those are your 2 major categories. Like I said, we're going to spend most of our time talking about synovial joints. So all of your synovial joints, because they are the movable joints, create combinations of these 3 movements here, right? Either a rolling action or a sliding action or a spinning action, depending on what type of joint they are. So we've got examples here. They're in the notes. I'm going to go ahead and move over to the PowerPoint just because it's a little easier to see it all. But if we look at like the gliding joints, right? A good example of gliding joints are all of the carpels of your hands, right? So for instance, when we talked earlier about like all of those wrist bones that are in your carpels, right? They all got to be able to kind of glide off of one another and kind of like move around. Honestly, that rock that I showed you guys earlier, right? The bendable rock. It's probably an example of like a lot of bones or a lot of rocks that are just gliding along one another. And so it kind of gives it this illusion that it's bending, right? Your hand is a good example of that. Your foot's a good example of that. There's just a lot of gliding that has to occur there, but there's also a little bit of gliding that occurs, in your femur and stuff when you're doing that knee extension, right? It kind of glides back into place. You've also got what's called like a condyloid joint. Condyloid joints are where basically like the condyles, the bone comes up and then it kind of projects like this, kind of fit into the cavity of like another. So if you look at like, I always tell, I tell you guys, I can't draw a bone very well that's accurate, but I can kind of draw like a dog bone, and so like what that does is that sits on something that has sort of like a cave that kind of looks like this, right? And actually that's totally not what it looked like. It would just kind of look like that actually. And there you go, right? Like now this is going to kind of insert into this, and that's going to keep it and help it maintain its stability there, right? So condyloid joints are where condyles, these projections are fitting into another bone. You've got hinge joints. Hinge joints basically move in one direction. They can hinge back and forth. Your elbow is a perfect example of this. It can hinge like this. Now you might be thinking it's like, well, I can do this too, right? And I can rotate. I can do like a lasso movement. Yeah, kind of. But actually pay attention to your elbow. You can't really, like this joint right here cannot go side to side. Like I'm going side to side here. That's happening at my shoulder, right? If I decide to do like a lasso movement, that's happening from here down, right? But this section here can only hinge back and forth. Look at your elbow. And you'll see the way the bones fit into one another. That's all they can do. That's not a good picture. Yeah, so you can actually see the back of it there. So see how that bone's coming up and it's got this projection here that sits into this little tube, right? That's not going side to side. Like you're not peeling it this way. If you do, you're going to dislocate the bone. You go this way, it's not going anywhere. It just hinges back and forth. So that's a hinge joint. You've got a saddle joint. This is a really probably the most fun one. It exists in one place. Well, I guess two places because you got two of them. Your thumbs. Your thumbs they're so close to being a ball and socket joint, but they just got a little bit of a unique shape here. And so it's where one bone kind of fits onto the other one. So it can almost do like a perfect circle, but when you try to like spin your thumb, it kind of does that like snap once it gets to that one place, it kind of snaps into the next one. That's because of that saddle action. It kind of looks like a saddle. You got pivot joints, which are basically going to pivot. Like I said earlier, when you look at your radial ulnar joint, it's a really good example, right? Where you can see these like two bones coming together here. One of them is going to swing around the other one. Oh, that's not. Come on, internet, give me the freaking GIFs I want. Show me. I don't want to pull up the videos because if I pull up a video, I gotta watch an ad. All right, let's look at that movement. Not buying your t-shirts. Show me. Oh, you know what? Let's try Googling that. Pronation, supination. Aha, there we go. So you look at this, right? And it can pivot. It can pivot from one side to the other. It's literally spinning every time you move your wrist like this. Now one bone is pivoting from one side to the next. So that's pronation, which would be this, and supination, which is that. You can think of it this way. You are prone, you're supine, give me soup. That's how I like to remember that. And then lastly, we got the ball and socket joint. Your ball and socket joint, coolest joint in your body, can literally do every type of movement, right? It can do what's called circumduction, which is a combination of every type of movement that you've got. It can rotate, right? It can hinge, it can pivot, it can spin. It does everything that it wants to do. And that's why that is the most mobile joint in the body, which is great. Love having that increased mobility, allows us to do really cool movements. Your hip joint, that's also ball and socket. But the one issue with that ball and socket joint is the fact that with all that increased mobility comes very decreased stability. It is very easy to dislocate a joint with so much space in it. And so oftentimes we hear of like shoulder and hip dislocations. So those are all the various joint motions that we are going to be looking at once we get to the second half of class, or of course, this course, I should say. And we're going to be looking at the various ways that those bones are all fitting together and moving, and how they're really designed to move, right? So looking at the function of like your joints, like I said, this gives us a way to manipulate our skeleton, but you can see it's a very purposeful way to manipulate your skeleton. If you try to take a saddle joint and move it like a ball and socket joint, it snaps from one place to the other. But if you try to force it to happen, you might end up dislocating your thumb, which is not going to feel super great, right? Your bones are going to move in the way that they are shaped or designed. That's where all of our form comes from. This is why we care about someone's knees caving in when they're squatting. You know, I do not like that version of a squat, you know. Why? Because it's putting stress on the wrong parts of their bones. This version here, she is killing it, right? And honestly, this one's actually not so bad either. Now, that's a very specific type of squat. I mean, her knee is actually tracking a little in narrow. She's, oddly enough, she needs to push even further, even though she's already very wide. That's a sumo squat, right? And that's its own version. But you can see, like, the reason we care about like this tracking is because it's making sure that the bones aren't grinding. They're putting the right pressure in the right places. And one thing that we need to understand is like where it's coming from. Why are her knees caving in? You know what? It could actually be an ankle problem. I was like, well, is it a knee problem? Well, maybe. But remember, your knee is located between your hip and your ankle. So if there's hip dysfunction or ankle dysfunction, it's going to affect the knee. This is why when we see someone's knees caving in, you know, the first thing we look at is we look at like hip dysfunction. It's like, okay, chances are their glute muscles aren't firing properly to drive the hip out to keep the knee in alignment. But we also take a look, it could be the lateral portion of their calf, and their calf could be really tight. And if that outside portion of their calf is really tight, it's going to turn their feet this way and take the stretch away from the calf, which is going to cause the knees to buckle in that way. And that is one of the things that we are going to learn in the second half. I know a lot of you guys already know that because we've talked about it before, but you know, we look at NASM's approach. They have a little cheat sheet, right? Oh. Is that just it? Maybe that'll work. Who's this? So we look at like knees caving in, right? There it is. Our knees are caving in. Yeah, the adductors are a little tight. The hamstrings a little tight. But we also see the lateral gastrocnemius. We see the calf muscle there. That calf is limiting how much the ankle is able to move. And so because of that, they're not able to move, you know, they're not able to move properly and their knees buckle inwards. So all of these joints require like something to stabilize them because like, you know, the bones aren't fitting in directly or because there's like a lot of space. We need to have a type of tissue that's going to hold them together. That tissue is going to be our ligaments. So your ligaments are the connective tissue that attach one bone to another. So you can actually see that ligament here. There's your femur, right? So your femur is this huge bone, your tibia is this huge bone, and your quadriceps are this huge muscle that's able to exert like a lot of force. This is why we have so many ligaments in our knee, right? So if we think about like the fact that we've got, you know, our femur comes down, looks something kind of like that. Our tibia comes up, it looks something kind of like that, right? Whoa. Right, and then we'd have like our fibula over here. You know, this little like knob bone that runs like that, right? This is kind of what it looks like, right? Well, we've also got all these ligaments. We've got your two cruciate ligaments. You've got your anterior cruciate ligament in the front, going like that. You get your posterior cruciate ligament in the back, going like that, right? Coming from behind. You've got your LCL ligament, that's your lateral collateral ligament, over here on the lateral side, creating stability there. And you've got your MCL, that's your medial collateral ligament. Okay, 4 ligaments in the knee right out the gate, plus all these other structures. You've got like a meniscus on both sides, like here, keeping the knee in the cavity. You've got a kneecap, this patella in the front that's like, you know, there in the front, like creating a little bit more stability, right? We've got all these like structures inside our knee that are there holding us, right? Ligaments are the connective tissue that are holding our bones together. Because again, with increased mobility, there's a lot of space between these joints, comes increased stability. So we have to have this ligament in place to hold it, right? So ligaments are only going to be found in synovial joints, because remember, synovial joints are the joints with a big amount of space. Fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, they don't need ligaments, right? And so they allow one bone to connect to another. Now, these are really great, but the one problem with them is that, look at them, they're white tissue. We draw them in white because that's sort of representing that they get very limited blood flow, because there's not very many red blood cells running through there. They don't get stained a dark red the way like a lot of our other tissues do. And that means that they do not repair very quickly. This is why you hear about so many people like taking so much time to come back from like a sprained ankle, you know. A sprained ankle is going to take a really long time to heal because the tissue associated with it, the tear in that ligament, is going to take a very long time to come back from. This is why, and this sounds kind of crazy sometimes, but like I've had clients sprain, you know, clients ask me like, you know, which is worse, like a fractured bone or like a sprained ankle? And I'm like, honestly, I'd rather break my ankle than I'd rather sprain it. Because like I can come back from a broken ankle pretty easily. My skeletal system will just build that tissue back up and it'll be nice and strong, you know, but a sprained ligament in that ankle is pretty problematic, because like that tissue just doesn't repair very quickly and I lose all that stability. So they do have limited blood flow. They do repair much more slowly. This is one of the reasons why we need to take so much time to build up our stability and train our clients with proper form, to ensure that we are training those ligaments. We're getting blood flow. When you do like a really slow duration exercise for a very high number of repetitions, it drives blood into our connective tissue. And that's why when you do like deloads from really heavy lifting, you often do high repetition, because that high repetition is what's going to drive that blood and cause that to repair. So that's our favorite way to do that. So they provide dynamic stability as well as a little bit of proprioception. You've got sensory receptors in those ligaments, but they don't adapt. They don't repair very easily. So now, based on all the anatomy of all this stuff that we've talked about, you know, today, and kind of circling back around, it starts to give you, and I know I already mentioned this earlier, but it gives you an understanding of why it is, I say, it's so important to engage in weight-bearing exercise. Exercise that actually forces your body to work against gravity as a resistance, because that's what's going to put the most stress on your skeletal system, and it's going to keep your ligaments, your bones, all your connective tissue, your entire skeletal system very, very, very healthy. Running, lifting weights, body weight exercises like calisthenics, the Stairmaster, you know, boot camps, sandbags, kettlebells, barbells, dumbbells, you know, all of it. Anything that's working directly against gravity are very good examples. Now, for the record, I love swimming. I love cycling. I like resistance bands. All of those things are actually very good versions of physical activity and very good versions of exercise, but they're not necessarily weight burning. They burn lots of calories. They're very good for your cardiovascular system. But if I had a client with osteoporosis, I'm probably going to put the emphasis on all this weight bearing stuff instead. And that's about it, guys. That is today's lesson. We actually wrapped up a little early today. Marvin, that's going to be good for you because I know you got to bounce out of here. Yeah, any questions, guys? How's everybody feeling about all that? My new folks?
Good.
Yeah, Melissa's doing good. Cyrus, yeah, feeling good.
Yes, sir.
Love that. All right, so guys, today is day 2. You know what that means? It means homework number 1 for this class is going to go out. There's going to be 4, right? 2, 4, and then there'll be a test on day 6. But there'll be homework on day 8 and 10. So 4 pieces of homework, 2 tests. So if I can just keep Marjan and Marvin, if I can hang on to you guys for like just a minute here, I want to show you how to use Canvas to get your homework done. But any other questions? And if not, if no other questions, I can let you guys out of here, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.
All right. Thank you. See
All
you
right.
tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
See you later, guys.